Yeah, I took a very brave decision and decided to be the only man in the room not wearing check shirt or hoodie. There's got to be one creative individual in the room, hasn't there? They said, get your audience on the side. I have done rather a lot. I've worked at a lot of places because I'm relatively old and have been with this industry since it started. Those on the wall behind me is, I've worked at some of the companies and some of the clients I've had when I've been freelance. So I've been around the block. The last gig I had before the RSC was at Microsoft Studios, Xbox. So it was really nice to hear Microsoft being praised this morning, especially in a room full of Apple. Oh yeah, I've got an iPhone, not a Windows phone. Currently at the Royal Shakespeare Company on a long-term contract, implementing digital transformation in the business side of things. And that's included a website, CMS, live data dashboards, predictive analytics, and much more, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Lincoln Media School, and as was mentioned, that's my second album, which is good value. It's on iTunes and everything, yeah? So please buy. And the books are on Amazon. So the books are an interesting case because I think a lot in my jobs about how we do things and why we do things and how to effect change in organizations, particularly recently. And the books, the science fiction stories, are ways of me just expressing and exploring the technological impacts of these things on people. And I just find that a very interesting way of sort of, you know, framing arguments and thinking through things rather than just trying to put words onto a PowerPoint slide in a beige office. It's much more exciting, science fiction. One of the things that the first thing I want to talk about, and briefly, quite briefly, and let me set my timer going so I don't talk over, I can talk for 4 hours, is my philosophy, really, because I've got a very mixed background, like a lot of people in our industry. And over the years, since around 1990, I've been sort of exposed to all the changes and been at the heart of them and been doing some pretty advanced stuff at various times. And all of that learning and the philosophy and everything that's sort of come about because of that is sort of now being put into play in businesses that are genuinely now really, really becoming 21st century businesses. Whether that be culture, gaming, news, whatever. And I think, you know, I'm sorry, I've got to put my glasses on to read the notes. The advantage is I look like Bono now. But I do want to focus mainly on process. Now, process is a subject that hovers in the background for all of us. And we have constant arguments about it. And, you know, there's no mistake. I don't think anybody has ever got process right, partly because we're all individuals and we all have certain needs and this, that, and the other. And one of the key issues, really, to summarize what I'm going to say, is that process is actually, funnily enough, not people-centered. Yet everything we're trying to make is people-centered. And there's a long history and a sort of reason behind that. And I think, you know, the reason we like process and we hang on to process is because our intelligence in there is pattern recognition based. We know that, you know, we look for patterns. We all suffer from pareidolia, you know, where you wake up in the night and think you see somebody sat on a chair at the end of the bed and it's just a scarf. You know, your brain actively seeks patterns. And similarly, when you're at work, the notion of process is necessary, I think, for us as humans, because we need that pattern. Even if we feel sometimes that processes are badly implemented, that doesn't matter. We need pattern, we need structure, we like structure. We rail against structure, we break structure down, and we almost immediately replace with another structure. Yeah? Very rarely do we truly get anarchic. And if our intelligence is pattern-based, why aren't our processes doing that? Now, I was just struck reading, you know, this quote that we have, this notion of development in artificial intelligence about a move towards pattern recognition rather than hard AI. And that is because there's this notion of selective attention. When we're developing something, we don't need to focus on everything. We just need to focus on what needs doing. And that, to me, sounds like web design. It sounds like process. It sounds like life. It sounds like making a cup of tea. One of the biggest problems when you're designing artificial intelligence is, it might be able to beat someone at chess or at Go, but you put a robot in an unfamiliar flat and it can't make a cup of tea. When you think about it, we have not very much advanced yet, and that is why we still need process. 25 years ago, when I started working with computers and digital, as it's now known, or now increasingly not known, I was actually an exhibiting artist, and I went off and did a master's degree, the only one in Europe that taught artists how to program. It was pre-web. The internet I used was text-based. It took 3 days to render 3 moving balls on a VAX cluster. And if it crashed 2.5 days into it, that was another 3 days. And it was primitive, but the course I went on took artists and took artistic practice and made a benefit and a virtue of it. We did things, we tried, we iterated, we tried again. We, looked at it a different way, came back to it, put it away, and so on. And, while we were in that mode, it was wonderful. But then I left and went into the world of interactive television, into one of the 2 interactive TV companies at the time. And I was confronted for the first time with heavy engineering processes. The traditional stage gate processes. And stage gate processes were necessary because with old school engineering like this, you've got 10,000 components in a car like that. If one component's out, you might end up having to retool entire machines, setups, going back, costing millions. And so at every stage, things had to be tested and checked. And things had to be broken down, and it was rigid. Nothing would move forwards until it was signed off. And that really was what we inherited. And we're still sometimes working companies that operate like this, stage gate, waterfall processes. But luckily, we then had the web boom, and we had things like tools like Flash. We had all these sort of more flexible tools come along, and we started seeing the emergence of lean principles. And we started to take control back. And I remember being around at that time and it being very liberating that suddenly you could start to iterate again. And I'd had 8 or 9 years at that point where I couldn't. I'd find myself waiting weeks for something to be signed off before I could go on to the next thing. And lean was an interesting sort of movement, out of which, of course, we've seen Agile, Scrum, and Rapid emerge. Rapid's an interesting one because Rapid is basically, as far as I can work out, just keep going, just keep doing stuff. And it's almost like, JFDI, but just with a fancy name. But what you also saw through the 2000s was a load of companies adopting agile methodologies to build things, but not adapting their business process. And so one place I worked in called that Wagile. It's a mocking term, but the problem with Wagile, of course, is it pulls you from top to bottom. Because you're over there in design and UX and coding, and you're all trying to work to Scrum and with great agility, and then the business stops you. Yeah? And this has led to some terrific casualties. Not least these 3, Atari, Blockbuster, and Kodak. Kodak's the famous old chestnut of a story that their 125,000 people were outgunned by 12 people at Instagram, doing effectively the same things. And the problem is that these businesses were very, very inflexible, and they couldn't react. But businesses are waking up, and they are learning. This doesn't matter so much if you're in a small micro business, because you can work the way you want to do. But when you get into places like Aviva, where I worked for a while, you have processes in place that have been there for 40 years. And you can't shift it. And people who've worked there for 40 years. And in some cases, IT that's been there for 40 years. Little beige boxes that you're not legally allowed to touch because they carry live policies still. So you've got all sorts of problems like that, but there have been movements to deal with this, and philosophically, and this is why I said the first half of this is philosophically. One thing I came across a few years ago in a big business was systems thinking. Anyone heard of systems thinking? Interesting. Well, systems thinking, if you like, is a business process equivalent of design thinking. But in a way, it is slightly different because the nature of what it's trying to do is different. But I've seen big businesses now trying to introduce things like system thinking. So what they've recognized is they've got these event-oriented thinking processes, causal things. We do this, we stop, we do this, we stop, we do this. But actually the business underneath, the audiences and the products they're making are not working like that. And so what systems thinking is about understanding the business as a complex system and understanding not the thing the person's working on, but how it connects with the other things. So the impact when you make a change is what's important, not the change to the thing itself. And this is a profound shift because in those businesses that are applying that, it suddenly makes it a lot easier to do design thinking. You've heard of design thinking? Crikey, you have, of course you have. You're designers. Design thinking is dressed up in all sorts of articles and videos and this, that, the other, and blogs. It's basically just how designers have always worked. And that's a model, really, in very simple terms of design thinking as a process. You take insight, you develop empathy, you understand your audience. It's like we talked about this morning. You then narrow down into some sort of definition of what you think you want. You then come up with, you work out what people are wanting, then you create some ideas based on what you think people are wanting. You prototype it, you test it until you arrive at a solution. And that solution, that process can be repeated over and over and over and over. That process might run for a day, it might run for a month, might run for a week. And in parallel, in businesses with systems thinking, you get a quite flexible environment that actually is incredibly responsive. Because when you, as designers, work to these processes, the business can actually keep up because they're concentrating on the links between them and you rather than the actual business, process, if you like, that they've got going on in their own job. They do something, they think, how does this affect this? How does it link with this? And it allows for a great deal of flexibility, but it is nothing new. It actually is just how designers were taught, how they've always worked, and how artists have worked. And this is really where, just to wrap up the sort of philosophy bit of what I'm talking about. And so to get to when you look at standard models of the creative process, it talks about all these things on the screen. But of course, visual artists have been doing this for years. Now, I don't know about you, when I go in a gallery and I look at something like this, the room of Rothko's, I don't see a series of finished paintings. Perhaps because I went to 4 art schools and studied fine art in great depth. But I see a set of partial answers and partial questions. I see these as the points at which the artist iterates. When an artist paints like this, they will work on it, they will stop halfway through and they will put it against the wall because they can't solve a problem and they need to think about it. They will talk to people, they'll go out, they'll have dinner, they'll think. Test, in other words. Yeah? And then they'll come back and finish it. And they might finish it after they've finished another one in between. But the minute that work is finished, the artist looks at it and says, well, actually, it's the next set of questions. And there's a question, of course, that things are never finished. And, we're in a world now where we're doing continual development. And you'll see with the RSC website and the other stuff we've got behind, we are now in a position there of, where I've implemented iterative development rather than big bang projects. Artists do this. There was a famous case of an artist who went into, I think, the National Gallery and sat down and started finishing his painting that was on the wall. And of course, he got thrown out and arrested. But it had obviously been bothering him that, that he hadn't quite got it right. And I have to say, as an artist who's sold some work in the past, and things like the albums and the books, you read them and you think, it's not right, I need to do another one. Now, if you think about it, that's how we should be working philosophically. You know, we are all actually artists now, and we are all also project managers. Because if everything is linked, everyone has a responsibility to understand the effect of what they do on other people. And that means the silos have got to go. You've got to be comfortable working with IT. You've got to be comfortable working with business people. They have different drivers and needs, but as long as you can establish a common language that explain those links and the impacts, you can work together. I mean, one other thing before I finish the philosophy side, because I've gone through 15 minutes, I've got another 5 minutes, which is a personal plea, and I always take public things to do with a personal plea. I love these two pictures, because if you look at that, you've got the girl painting the unicorn, and then you've got the girl painting the unicorn. There's no difference. They're just using different paint palettes and technology. The process, the thinking, the way it's being done hasn't changed. Just the tool set. And I'm convinced, the longer I've been in this industry, that the problem here is we get too hung up on tool sets. And we don't keep our eye on the philosophical ball. You know, why are we trying to do what we do? What are we trying to do? How are we trying to do it? Because you know what? I can just pick up any set of tools and make them work for me. I'm an artist. You're a designer, you're a creative, you're the same. You know, a designer should be able to solve a problem from any given set of starting points. It might not be the solution you're expecting because you change the inputs, but there should be some sort of solution. And I think what's brilliant of working in this industry now is the tool set, the palettes, the platforms are all over the place. I mean, the previous talk about, you know, the fact that browsers on everything is fantastic. What an opportunity. You know, what an opportunity to communicate with people and to help people do things. Anyway, so I think going ahead the next 10 years, you should start thinking like artists. And we should change design thinking as a title to art thinking. And upset the man who runs IDEO, who came up with the title. Yeah. So, I'll talk a little bit about the RSC. So I was hired by the RSC 15 months ago to do 2 and a bit years of digital transformation. That meant all sorts of things. I'll focus on the websites given the audience, okay? When I arrived, this is what the website looked like. Now, the yellow and blue boxes don't have images in, but they did have images in when it was live, okay? When we tested that, it was fair to say people weren't sure we were a theatre. Okay? They thought we were a ticketing site. And it's not that it was bad. It functionally worked, and we got a lot of traffic, you know? But it didn't work on mobiles. It was completely unresponsive, etc. So when I arrived, I had the whole problem of working out what to do. I did a temporary fix and made it look like that. Still wasn't responsive, but at least it looked fairly modern. And when you went onto a mobile device, the problem, sorry, I've forgotten your name, from BBC said about, you know, a website becoming smaller on a screen was solved because these lozenges were actually suitably big for people to be able to hit with their fingers. But it was very much a compromise. So that was January 2015 when I switched that on. And then in November, following that, hired a designer. Andrew, can you stand up? Our designers are waving. So the thing you're going to see next is his fault. And he's taking questions and beer later. He's Irish, so he's expecting a few beers. So we decided we had to change. So I bought a new CMS. We moved all the background architecture onto the cloud from this point in January 2015. And we did lots of other significant system changes. Installed the CMS and did a top-down redesign without trying to lose the heritage of what we'd had previously. And that's where we got to the current site. Fully responsive. Thanks to Andrew. I have to say that. I wasn't going to say that, but he followed me up to the conference. And it is fully responsive, and this is how it looks across platforms. You can see, you know, the classic sort of thing. But, you know, we're a theatre. We're a world-class theatre. And we've now got a website that has world-class imagery. that looks contemporary, all the things we should be putting across as our brand message, and that actually in testing, we're finding people are finding it very, very easy to get to ticket buying, which is the main problem. In fact, it was so easy, it overloaded the system the first time they did it en masse. Nice problems to have, I guess. But that allowed all sorts of things. That is not the finished website. That is the minimum viable product that we have live. We were so far behind in this thinking that I've had to leapfrog a long way. That website is minimum viable product. The work has not slowed down or finished. It is in continual development now, like you would find on Facebook, etc. Because, our customers are changing. Like the BBC, we have a slightly older audience, wealthy audience, etc. And believe it or not, they've all got iPads and smartphones. And since we've launched this, we've seen a bloody big rise in mobile usage in particular. And we're getting smart. The CMS I bought tells us all sorts of things about the audience and allows us to produce different versions depending on where you're looking at the site from. So you get a different version in North America than you do here, all on demand and dynamically. And this is how we've sort of, talking at the start about process, this is how we've kind of rolled the web development into a process going forwards. I've got the Mac's dying, 3 sets of data coming in. At the top there on the left, I've got Google Analytics, full Google Analytics, down to the bottom, proper tagging. I've got a piece of software we're using called Lucky Orange that does heat mapping, that tells us how far people are going down screens. It records people's actions, so we can watch people struggling, or not, as the case may be. And at the bottom, the CMS that we bought has something in it that allows us to do predictive content analysis based on personas that we set up. And we have 9 agreed segmented personas that are agreed with the Arts Council, people like that. So, when we find something and as we watch the data, that pops into a feature request. Every week, that feature request list is reprioritized and it's gone away and worked on continually. And then it's tested. We look at the results, we change it accordingly, and so on. To finish, that's not the only thing, of course, we're doing. That is one aspect of it. Alongside that, I'm building version 2 of live data dashboards. I built a data dashboard, put it on a TV, and put it on the roof above the marketing department desks. So every time they do anything, they can see what's happening live in emails, on the site, in the ticketing engine, etc. Version 2 of that will have many more controls and comparisons available. So they'll be able to say, we've just launched a season. How does this compare to a similar season? And see it live as it's changing. And that is how I'm changing the culture there. I've gone back to the basics and said, what do the audience want? And I'm using hard, live data to enable change. Because in the end, the only thing that gets things to change in businesses is the money. And if you can prove to a business that your change is effective, it will change. It's a hard realism. Anybody here, some of you, obviously, lots of you here run your own business. I'm afraid the money does tend to come first. It shouldn't necessarily, but, But if you can provide that concrete argument, you get the change. And the beautiful thing about the tool sets and the approaches we've got now is we can also be satisfied as creatives because we can work like artists in that data. That data actually supports what we do. I'll stop. The bell went and you said wanted some question time, or unless you want me to go on for another 2 hours. This will segue quite nicely into the next talk, actually, so it'll be a good hour. Thank you.